Bonsoir. Good evening. Bienvenue. Welcome. A warm welcome to everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the third biennial International Convention of Psychological Science in the City of Life, beautiful lights, also life, beautiful Paris. I am Barbara Tversky. I'm president of the Association of Psychological Sciences. More than 2,500 of you have come to this amazing event, and you come from over 70 countries. Wow. Sponsoring the international conference is just one of the many ways that APS continues to promote psychological science as a global, multidisciplinary field. In fact, this ICPS showcases research that crosses disciplines and methods. We'll learn about cutting-edge research not only in psychology, but in anthropology, biology, linguistics, neuroscience, computer science, and more. So many of these other fields are realizing that human behavior is critical to their own missions and are seeking collaborations with us. These collaborations, in turn, enrich and broaden our own understanding of perception, cognition, emotion, social behavior, and health. In fact, you'll get an opportunity in the next few days to learn about this. Our focal integrative science symposia feature world-renowned researchers working on critical topics from a wide range of scientific perspectives. Linked to the symposia are workshops that will offer you a chance to get depth on the methods and techniques. And if this weren't enough, the meeting also gives us the excitement of connecting with old friends and collaborators and meeting new ones. By the end of the event, I have no doubt that you'll be inspired and equipped to move beyond disciplinary and geographical limits to explore new scientific frontiers. And ICPS will continue. I'm pleased to announce that the 4th International Convention of Psychological Science will take place in Brussels in 2 years, in March 2021, and I look forward to seeing you there. Now some thank yous. A lot of people worked to make this meeting so wonderful. The invited program was assembled by a committee headed by Yoshihisa Kashima and Asaf Majeed. The committee members include, their pictures were up here a while ago, Katerina Fotopoulou, Elizabeth Pacheri, and Johan Lundström. We owe them a great deal of appreciation for assembling such a fantastic program. I also want to take a moment to recognize the marvelous staff of APS, which has made everything here work smoothly, and to the sponsors of ICPS, Sage Publishing, the Kavli Foundation, the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, and the Psychonomic Society. Please join me in thanking these partners and the organizing committee for their support. Those participating organizations have organized special symposia and other events at ICPS, and you can find them in your program group book or on the app. You've probably seen and perhaps been helped by the lively team of ICPS volunteers. They're wearing teal t-shirts. Many of them belong to the Junior Research Program, an international initiative for students and early career researchers in psychological science. Please join me in giving all of our volunteers a round of applause to show our gratitude. So on behalf of the steering committee and APS, I would like to dedicate this convention to the memory of Walter Mischel, who passed away suddenly last summer. He would have loved to have been here. Walter was a major intellectual force behind APS and this event, and on a personal note, a close friend. His wisdom and commitment to integrative psychological science will hover over us throughout this event. Now it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to ICPS 2019 Program Co-Chair, Asfa Majeed, who will introduce tonight's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Barbara. Our Fred Kavli keynote speaker tonight has pioneered the use of human neuroimaging to understand typical and atypical development. BJ Casey explores the development of the brain circuitry involved in learning and behavior regulation. She's identifying genetic and environmental factors that heighten the risk for disorders emerging in childhood, and learning how these factors can vary over the course of development. Her work has illuminated how early life stress can alter the functioning of the amygdala, spurring emotion regulation problems and anxious behavior well past childhood. Her discoveries of the biological factors related to vulnerability and resilience to mental illness during the early postnatal and adolescent periods have begun to inform when and how to target treatments to the individual based on age and genetic profile. BJ's work has taken a particular focus on adolescents, and she's shown that risky and impulsive behavior in teenagers results in part from their heightened sensitivity to rewards, threats, and social influences. At the same time, she has shown that the teenage years are a period in life when the brain is at its most plastic and adaptable to the many challenges that come with adolescence, including the emergence of mental health problems. She's received numerous grants, including from the US National Institutes of Health, as part of the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development, or ABCD study, which is enlisting 10,000 young participants to study how drugs affect the teenage brain. The ABCD study, BJ says, is giving scientists an important opportunity to discover how to tap into the teens' brain plasticity to change behavior and ultimately reduce mental illness among young people. BJ earned her PhD at the University of South Carolina in the United States. After serving as assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, she spent 17 years on the faculty at Yale Medical School at Cornell University. Is it Weil? I've said it wrong. After all that. She currently serves as a professor of psychology and director of the Fundamentals of the Adolescent Brain Lab, which has the acronym FAB Lab, and is guest investigator at the Rockefeller University. She's the author of nearly 200 publications and a recipient of numerous awards, including an honorary doctorate from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Thomson Reuters in 2015 named her one of the world's most influential minds. So please join me in welcoming BJ Casey.
Thank you for that generous introduction. It's so lovely to be here, and I wanted to thank Barbara, the association, the program committee, and all of you for being here instead of out and about in the beautiful city of Paris. While I'm acknowledging individuals, the most important slide that I could show today, and it will be one of many acknowledgement slides, but this is to acknowledge all of the many mentees I've had the beautiful opportunity with whom to work. And as you'll notice, this is an amazing group of brilliant, creative women and a few good men, extraordinary men too. I also would like to acknowledge Mike Posner, who was a psychologist that took a chance on me and to help position me in a leadership and a mentor role that's given me the opportunity to work with so many of these wonderful individuals. And also just a shout out, Liat Lavita has put together a symposium on adolescence and threat, and that will be at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and that's featuring several speakers, including Dylan G. and also Ali Cohen. So I just arrived last night after a 30-hour trip from Central America. I was there because my son was attending the Envision Festival. This is an international annual meeting where young people come together because of their love for the outdoors, spirituality, their love for dance, and for music. He was there with what I'll refer to as his friends who are later in adolescence. And what I appreciated during my interactions with him as he was taking breaks from the festival is the reason that I really, truly love adolescence. And that's because of the intensity of the feelings that you have during this time. The incredible highs, the highest of highs, that might be a pun too at these festivals, the lowest lows, the loves, the losses, the successes, the failures. This might also be this intensity, the reason why I and many people in this audience wouldn't want to relive our adolescence necessarily. But this intensity, particularly emotional responses and social interactions, I want to suggest to you is really a process that needs to occur in order to instantiate the critical learning that is necessary to become a pro-social adult in the larger society. There are many challenges the adolescent has to overcome without the buffer of the caregiver or the parent. So these include social, physical, intellectual, sexual challenges that they have to master in order to proceed to the next stage. Yet, it's this stage of development that is such a huge task that gets such a bad rap by many of us sometimes, and also the media. So too often, we reduce the adolescent to having a brain of a defective car. No brakes, no steering wheel, just an accelerator. And that's the way that we often describe them. And as my colleague and friend Larry Steinberg has often said, you know, in other developmental stages, such as when the newborn can't talk or walk, we don't call that a deficit or deviant. Instead, we call that typical development. If a newborn could talk and walk, that would be incredibly odd. So when an adolescent makes a bad choice or decision in the heat of the moment, this is when we tend to call them deviant. But there's a basis for that. When we look at the age crime curve, we do see an increase over the period of adolescence from the mid-teens to the early 20s, in which there's an increase in criminal behavior. You'd be hard-pressed to predict which of these individuals actually then goes on to continue to engage in criminal behavior, however. This is also a time in which we have the highest prevalence of mental health problems. And you can see that illustrated here if we just look at the average. It's during this adolescent period in which they are peaking and then are sustained, in many cases, through adulthood. So trying to understand how the brain and psychological processes are developing and changing during this time is absolutely key for helping to inform issues of resilience as well as risk for these individuals. So let me just begin by defining what I mean by adolescence, because it's relatively broad, and that is the transition from dependence on the caregiver or parent to relative independence from the caregiver. The onset is around puberty, and my son will actually confirm if it's independence financially, he's going to be an adolescent for a long time. The characterization that has come from the psychological literature and what I was trying to sort of highlight in describing the Envision Festival is this heightened sensitivity to rewards and threats and social influences that can impact the adolescent's ability to engage in self-control. And by self-control, I'm referring to our capacity or ability to suppress inappropriate thoughts, actions, emotions, desires, in favor of more adaptive, goal-oriented ones. So there are actually 4 questions that I'd like to highlight for you today that our lab has been trying to tackle. One is under what circumstances does self-control break down in the adolescent? And what circumstances do you not see that diminished self-control? When does this ability reach developmental asymptote? And how does this ability vary across individuals? And more recently, my work has really been focusing on social interactions, social structure, and environmental factors that might impact self-control as an external force, where most of my early research is focused predominantly on the individual. So if we first just focus on self-control in terms of regulating our actions or a habitual action that you need to just stop, one of the ways that we measure this in the lab is a GoNoGo task. And so what I'd like to do is to have you engage in this task, even though I know what many of you have performed or used this task in your experiments, but because it's going to be the basis for many other experiments I describe, I'd like for all of you to whack the mole whenever he's digging up the garden and to say, whack. But if there's a vegetable there, I'd like for you to refrain from saying whack. And I want you to go as quickly as you can and try to be accurate. Okay? Okay, now let me show you where you are on the developmental curve. So, this is just looking at accuracy. I plotted it as D prime. That just includes our false alarms or commission errors that we make, as well as misses. And so what you can see is that by the mid-teen years, we're reaching developmental asymptote and performance on this task. However, you can also see that there's some teenagers that actually outperform some young adults. And for some of us in the audience, not only are we over there in terms of age, but our performance as well. So this was a task where we were just trying to stop our actions, and I've been highlighting the importance of learning social information in the environment during adolescence so they can establish their social role and learn how to be adults in a pro-social way in society. So let's just focus on these social influences, social cues that have been associated with positive outcomes, acceptance, and potentially reward. This has been a large area of research in our lab where we focused on psychological and neural processes that are changing across development and how socio-emotional information impacts that. Today, given the conference, the convention, I'll be focusing predominantly on our psychological work. And just to highlight a couple of former trainees, Leah Somerville, associate professor at Harvard, and Todd Hare, who's now a professor at Zurich. And the question that they were interested in the context of self-control is what is the influence of positive social cues on our ability to regulate ourselves? So in a task very similar to Whack the Mole, they were just asked to refrain from acting or reacting to these positive social cues. And just as with the game you just played, these were rare cues as well. The stimuli that I'll be presenting today were developed by former trainee Nim Tottenham as part of the NIM STEM set that she had validated. So the question again is, how impulsive are we to social cues, positive and neutral, across development? So this will be a difference in the number of errors to a smiling face versus a neutral face. And what Leah showed is that there was an exaggerated number of errors for these positive social cues. And you didn't see this performance in children or adults when you controlled for their errors to neutral ones. If you look in the brain and you see what systems are paralleling the effect that we're seeing at the behavioral level, we actually see reward circuitry. So these are the behavioral data, and these are the brain data, and we see that the area of the nucleus accumbens that's very important in learning about values and reward outcomes has an exaggerated signal during this time relative to children and adults. And we see a protracted development in the prefrontal cortex when performing this task. But adolescence isn't all about rewards and acceptance and positive social interactions. In fact, if it were, maybe we would consider going back into adolescence. But there are real threats there too. And having the opportunity to learn on our own to regulate our emotions in these circumstances are important too, or to be very reactive so we know whether or not to flee or to fight or to freeze. And so in another experiment, we looked at threats. This was led by Michael Dreyfus. At this point, you're probably realizing anything highlighted in blue is a former trainee that I've had the opportunity to work with. Michael went back and analyzed data from several former trainees' work where he could just isolate the behavioral responses to cues of potential threat. Now, in this situation, I don't think that this cue is making you afraid. However, over a lifetime, we often associate when we see someone afraid, there's some uncertainty about is there some source or something that we should fear at this time. So Michael compared, again, impulsive errors to threat cues versus neutral cues. And again, he saw the very similar pattern. This was driven in part largely by males, but it still seems to hold true and has been replicated in a larger sample across the sexes. So again, there's this reactiveness to these social cues, in this case, one associated with threat. So it's not, as we sometimes describe adolescents, as just being impulsive. They tend to be impulsive and responsive to cues that provide valuable social and emotional information to the individual. So I now just want to move on to trying to understand when these abilities actually reach developmental asymptote, because I've kind of put them in neat, arbitrary boxes of teens, children, and then anyone 18 and over. Allie Cohen, who's in the audience and will be speaking tomorrow morning, she's now a postdoc at NYU. She asked the question of when is an adolescent an adult? And this is a collaboration with a number of legal scholars and psychologists and neuroscientists, in part because this whole notion of when is an adolescent and is an adult is very important for all of our countries where age of majority is typically set at about 18 in terms of giving the rights and also accountability to young people. Her hypothesis was that there would be a shift or a lag in the development of social-emotional control relative to simple cognitive tasks, such as the one that you performed with Whack-the-Mole. This was also a very important collaboration with Adriana Galvan, now a professor at UCLA that was formerly a graduate student with me. And we performed this study by recruiting a diverse community sample in New York at Cornell and also at LA with the UCLA staff in Adriana's lab. And then we were particularly interested in the age range of 18 to 21 in the United States and also other policies. It's when does an individual have special protection of their rights? When do they grow out of those special protections? When someone can purchase alcohol in the United States is 21, they can serve their country at 18. And so it's sort of a gray zone with regard to development. And Allie was very interested to see, is it the case that young adults look more similar to older adults, or do they look more similar to teens in these emotionally charged situations? So building on the previous examples that I've given you in simple experiments, she looked at self-control to positive social cues. So again, this is like a go-no-go type task to cues of potential threat. And then she had two other conditions, because usually when we're in emotionally aroused, charged situations, it's not just these little transient cues that are popping up, they're more sustained. So in one condition, she actually showed them a $100 bill, or this would be like 100 euros here, and she informed the participant that if the computer screen turned a certain color, she didn't know if or when or how much, but there was a possibility of them winning $100. And you got a reliable galvanic skin response of arousal and a reliable self-report that this was a positive condition for the participants. Now, there was also a sustained threat condition. And here we played an aversive sound that again, we got a reliable galvanic skin response to, showing arousal, and also a self-report that this was aversive to the participants. And they were told, we don't know when, we don't know if or how loud, but when the background color of the computer screen turns this color, this might occur. And it had nothing to do with their performance. It was completely unpredictable to the participant. So here you can see we can dissociate arousal and valence and look at brief and sustained, positive and negative emotionals and their effect on self-control across these developmental age groups. Again, with the question of, do 18 to 21-year-olds look more like juveniles or teens or adults? And the two conditions in which we saw robust differences where the 18 to 21-year-olds looked significantly different from older adults they were presented with cues of potential threat and under the conditions of uncertainty of a negative outcome. And this is shown for you here. So this is performance, again, in D prime, so it takes into consideration false alarms as well as misses in the performance. And we see that 18 to 21-year-olds are significantly different from adults to these cues of threat, similarly as teens are. Likewise, in the sustained periods of threat, we see a significant difference from the adults, and the teens are showing the significant difference as well. If you then look at neural correlates that are associated with this performance, what's interesting to see is that the older adults are actually showing more activity in lateral prefrontal control circuitry that's been associated with decision making. And you're not seeing that degree of activity in these younger ages, in the 18 to 21. But what you are seeing is they're activating more limbic cortical regions, suggesting that at the younger ages, the task is still more emotional, and at the older ages, it's more of, I've been instructed on what to do, I'm maintaining the task demands, and it's more of a cognitive task in their performance. So these findings are consistent with a number of studies in the literature that are emerging that suggest later development of social emotional control relative to cognitive processes. And this isn't just specific to our adolescents in the US or in New York or LA. Larry Steinberg and a number of colleagues have been doing cross-cultural validation of this development, and he sees a gap in the development of cognitive tasks relative to social emotional ones. This lag in development, or perhaps hierarchical changes in these abilities, actually map onto neurobiological models of the adolescent brain and breakdown in self-control, suggesting that these deep emotional centers related to desire and fear and rage, the circuitry within them is changing before circuitry between them and among them is fully developed. And this has been expanded upon in a recent publication with my colleagues, Aaron Heller, who I believe is here, Dylan G., and Ali Cohen. Again, building on Thalen's dynamic systems theory of development, where our development is experience dependent, and you see these hierarchical stages in terms of the abilities that are building upon one another. Likewise, during this extended developmental period, we're seeing many hierarchical changes. One where we're seeing connectivity and neurochemical changes at very low subcortical regions. We slowly see the circuitry begin to build and connect with one another to the point where we see cortico-cortical interactions at very complex levels of behavior and emotion. So the studies are showing this lag in social emotional control processes relative to cognitive, and we're seeing parallel hierarchical changes in brain circuitry and function. The next question that we've been asking is how self-control varies. So is this experience of adolescence the same for all individuals, or is it the same across development? And so here is where I would just like to acknowledge my friend and collaborator, Walter Michel. As I was about to walk over, this is the rainbow that was outside my window, and I felt that Walter, who loves Paris, was saying to me, I know your room doesn't have a view of the Eiffel Tower, so take this rainbow instead, and it's here with us today. So Walter has gotten so much attention for his work in so many areas, but much of the acknowledgement is for the marshmallow task. It gets covered in the media routinely, and also in cartoons, and about a number of individuals. But what's fascinating about the marshmallow task is very early in development, we can see individual differences in toddlers or 4-year-olds. And so it's the case in certain contexts that some of us succumb to temptation almost immediately, and there are others of us who can wait longer and reap the benefits of that delay. And so we've been interested in the cognitive and neural processes associated with self-control as measured by delay of gratification and how that would predict self-control later in life. And we had the wonderful opportunity to collaborate with Walter and several distinguished psychologists and neuroscientists to look at the original cohort that was tested at Stanford, on this marshmallow task at 4 years of age, and we were going to examine their performance 40 years later. So out of the original 500 of these children, over 100 were contacted. These were individuals who reliably showed that they were either above or below the average in their delay score. So I'm going to be referring to them as high and low delayers. And their average age was, the mean age was about 44. And so they performed, again, a variant of this impulse control task that I've described already. And there were 2 versions. One was just a neutral. You just had to not press a button if you saw a neutral expression. In one block of trials, you weren't supposed to press to a female face. In another group, you weren't supposed to press to a male face. And then we had what Walter would refer to as a hot condition, cold and hot, based on his work with Janet Metcalf, where there was a smiling positive cue. And we just wanted to look at performance on these 2 tasks to see, again, are they more impulsive in general, or is there something specific about their impulsivity? So these are the 2 tasks, and when we look at just the cold task first, we see that there are no differences between the high and low delayers, so they're not simply more impulsive. However, and I was honestly surprised we saw anything, but we actually observed to these positive smiling faces that this is when the low delayers, who couldn't wait to get 2 marshmallows and only have 1, were showing, as a group, more impulsivity to these positive social cues. And when we looked at the neural correlates that distinguish the behavior for this condition, it was the reward circuitry that was showing the difference, with the low delayers activating this region more than the high delayers. So differences in self-control as indexed by delay of gratification, they don't reflect this general being more impulsive, but they seem to be more specific to cues of value, marshmallow, smiling, accepting face. Walter and his colleagues have also gone on to show ways in which you can improve self-control. He used reframing in this work. And so he told children to think of the marshmallows as clouds, and he and his colleagues were able to show that individuals would actually delay longer when they imagined the marshmallows to be clouds. And this is really the basis and formation of another collaboration with Walter and Kevin Oxner and Jen Silvers, who led this and is now a faculty member at UCLA. Basically, what we wanted to use is sort of a form of reappraisal. And so when you see a appetitive, an actual dessert, to imagine it either being really close, almost as if you could smell it, as opposed to being far away and less seductive. So they were cued as to whether or not to imagine it being close or far. They then saw the appetitive treat. This is a chocolate chip cookie. It looks like the chocolate's actually melting. And then they were asked to say, how much do you want this? and give a rating. And what was observed is that individuals rated the craving as lower when they thought of it as far away as opposed to close, and this ability continued to develop into the early 20s. And as that ability continued to develop, we also saw less activity of reward circuitry and more activity of cognitive control areas, consistent with some of the earlier work that I was describing. Now, there was just recently, this work was published in Psychological Science, and I feel like I'm an advertisement for that journal. I don't have any investment in it, but I think as a group we do. So there was a recent article by Angela Duckworth and colleagues and a commentary by George Lowenstein, and I think the two together are just really powerful. George has, a colleague and friend, has suggested that we might want to consider self-control instead of this immediacy of events and not being able to think about the future, that we think more in terms of deliberative and affective components of self-control. In other words, those of us in the room who have to go back to the office next week, we're thinking we're not going to have time to eat, we're going to be catching up on emails, paperwork, students, and so why not today have a lavish meal? So it doesn't enjoy ourselves while we're here in Paris. So you might be thinking about the future, but then you're indulging today, and no better place than Paris, quite frankly, to indulge. He also in that article talks about external factors that have really been a focus more and more in our own research since I've moved to Yale in recent years. And so George suggests that, does it really seem likely that in the 1980s, Americans woke up and just no longer had self-control? Because when you look at the obesity index and the epidemic, it increased around this time. But there were other external events that were occurring too, and that was that the amount of savings average for each family was also going down. So he was suggesting that we need to consider these external factors that we have less control of, as opposed to always thinking that we have internal control. And that this might be associated with the growing income inequality in the United States. Now, I can also tell you that they were supersizing at fast food joints around the 1980s. And while fast food joints or stores, restaurants, have actually begun to offer healthier meals, they also know how to get us to value something. And so now they trick us into this, but 2 for 1, at a slightly higher price, but less than what it would be if you call it 2. So I think they're still impacting our self-control to some extent. And recent work shows that it's higher. SES, who are actually purchasing some of these lunches at times in recent work that's come out. A similar external factor would be work by my current postdoc, Cristina Rapuano, in collaboration with her colleagues, where she wanted to look at the effect of advertisements for alcohol on drinking behavior in young adults. And what they observed is that reward circuitry was activated during these ads for alcohol. That activation was associated with self-reported drinking behavior. And this association did not hold true for the comparison conditions, which included advertisements for automobiles and advertisements for mobile technology. So again, external factors that might be influencing self-control here. There are other broader components in society that can influence our self-control. And this is another paper that has recently come out in Psych Science, and this is a collaboration by Watson colleagues, where they showed if you considered the family background, early cognitive ability, and home environment, then our degree of predictability in terms of future outcomes for young people who perform the delay of gratification when they were children is somewhat diminished. There's also been ways that Yuko Munakata and her lab, they have shown If you manipulate in-group and out-group information to a child, you can change how long that they'll delay gratification. And so YUCO built on work from another one of my colleagues at Yale, Yarrow Dunham, where he showed if you just tell a child, you're on the green team, here's a green t-shirt, you're on the green team. And then another team is, say, the orange team, that they come to value being on that green team, so that if the child is told their team waits longer than the orange team, the other team, you see they actually delay gratification longer, and they come to value their in-group more. We've been interested in this in-group, out-group effect in another domain, and that is, since arriving at Yale, I'm part of the Justice Collaboratory, and this involves legal scholars, psychologists, philosophers, and neuroscientists, where we're very interested in self-control and also other issues that come into play in terms of the bridge between neuroscience and law. We also, several of us at Yale have been part of the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Network. And so Estee Ruby and Thomas, who's a fourth-year PhD student, has been very interested in trying to understand how confrontations or interactions with out-group, particularly under conditions of threat, can lead to a breakdown in self-control. And this is in our current day hearing so much more about how unarmed young men of color are unfortunately dying at the hands of police, and so trying to understand that. There are a number of collaborators on this, Jennifer Eberhardt, Kim Taylor-Thompson, Damian Fair, but just another shout out for a Yale colleague, Jen Richardson, who moved the same year that I did from Northwestern to Yale, and she's been very helpful in informing this study. So hopefully you already know cues of threat can lead to impulsivity. So this is one body of work that was driving Estee's study. We also know that there continues to be a persistent stereotype of black males as being threatening. And some of Jen's work and others have shown that interracial encounters can impact perception, cognitive control, and decision making. So Estee wanted to test and see, are individuals more impulsive using sort of these traditional GoNoGo tasks under conditions of threat? So we used the same threat condition of anticipating something bad, this loud noise that participants don't like, not knowing if or when. So it's a condition of uncertainty in terms of a bad outcome. She compared that to a neutral condition where they're performing the task, but they know nothing is going to happen during this time. And then to control for arousal, there's also a positive or excitement, the one that I mentioned before, where they could win up to $100, which is more in euros, right? The stimuli were predominantly black and white faces, and the participants are an equal number of black and white participants. We had about 10% that were Hispanic or Asian as sort of foil cues of race. Just another shameless, opportunistic opportunity to mention May Conley, one of my graduate students who has expanded the NIM-STEM and validated them in a radiate face stimulus set in collaboration with NIM. So in looking at whether or not we're more impulsive to black faces than white faces under threat, Estee looked at the difference between emotional states and when they were in a neutral state and how many false alarms they were making. And she looked at this for white faces that were presented on the screen and to black faces. And what she observed is that there was no difference in impulsivity across these conditions to the white faces, but there was a significant, for both black and white participants, they're more impulsive to black faces under these threatening conditions. And in the control arousal condition, where there was positive excitement, she didn't observe this effect. Trying to parse out sort of what this means, particularly with black and white participants showing this effect, she wanted to look at an area in the brain that's been associated with processing, this early perceptual processing of faces, particularly for in-groups and conspecifics, We know we get greater activity in this region, non-human primates and in humans. And so, unsurprising, based on the literature, she observed that white participants activated this fusiform face area more when they saw a white face, and black participants activated this region more when they saw a black face on the screen. But this isn't the pattern that we observed under threat. Under threat, we actually see that white participants are showing this really early response in the fusiform face area very quickly. And we're not seeing that in black participants, suggesting that the superficially similar behavioral findings that we have may have a very different mechanism underlying this impulsivity in the response to black faces. We've also been interested in looking at questions such as these in that late adolescent period, or what we'll refer to as young adult. I think it's its own developmental phase in its own right. And we've been examining this in the special environment of the prison. And this is work, again, driven by Estee, but in collaboration with another colleague at Yale, Arielle Summers. Arielle is like a legend. Very early after arriving at Yale, she was able to set up a laboratory within the prison system in Connecticut to do some of her work on psychopathy and antisocial personality. I was interested in collaborating with her, and this is part of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale too, because there's this new experimental unit in Connecticut. For Europeans, this doesn't sound like an experimental unit. That is, it's a unit that's set up that is remediation-based as opposed to punitive-based. And it's referred to as TRUE. You can see what the acronyms stand for here. And so young adults are placed there, they have mentors, and they're put in programs to prepare them to re-enter society. In these units, they spend much more time socializing and less time in their cell, as is typical in the US prison system. And they also spend time in the classroom and receiving education, and they have creative outlets as well. Now, while these young adults, 18 to the early 20s, are not considered juveniles by law, I hope that some of the data that I've shown you already shows and suggests that they still are similar in many ways in their psychological and brain maturity. So our question was, we wanted to compare individuals, these young adults, within the confines of the prison to a community sample. And first, we just wanted to look at race. So what is the impact of stimulus race on self-control within the confines of the prison and the community sample, this general population sample, traditional prison, and in this young adult unit? And what we see is individuals are more impulsive, whether they're black or white participants, to black faces than they are to white faces. And in the two prison samples that we tested, we did not see this race effect. There are a number of factors that could drive that. It could be prisoners or an in-group, but unfortunately in the US, we also have a disproportionate number of minorities that we incarcerate. So the majority of those individuals who are incarcerated in these two units are black individuals as well. Still, we had an equal number of black and white participants in both of these samples. Another question that we asked, and this is very preliminary data and we want to be able to replicate it, but it is hard to get this information from the prison, but to look at social emotional information in these young adults in prison in the two different units and also in the community. And for this, not only did we have the task that I've been describing to you before, but we also had a control task where they just had to withhold a response to an X that rarely occurred. And what we see is that there's no difference between the community sample, the young adult unit, or the regular prison unit in overall impulsivity. But what really pops out to me when I look at these data in response to the neutral faces, happy and fear, these social cues, is this blunted response in those individuals in the regular prison. Even relative, if we look here, relative to the control, but also In the young adult unit, we see more similar performance to our community sample, and particularly they're most impulsive to these positive social cues during this young adulthood. Now, to really say that this is the environment, we would have to have pre-incarceration data, and we only got access to these during the time in which they were incarcerated. But showing the similarities in performance across these units too, the community sample and this unit also suggests that there's just as much plasticity and potential perhaps for change in these individuals. So not thinking that something is this indefinite trait about someone, but really supporting thinking about remediation for individuals. So I hope I have shown that social factors are important for us to consider when we're thinking about self-control, when we're thinking about trying to enhance self-control, and also policies for trying to really enable and provide opportunities for young people to learn the self-control. And to also just to go back to the Envision Festival and to sort of, hopefully the data have suggested that adolescence is this extended period of development. It goes into the 20s. There's this heightened sensitivity to social situations and information. And we think that this sensitivity is actually helping to enhance their ability to learn about the social information, because this is going to be so key as they go on to take on adult roles in the larger society. So ensuring opportunities for this behavior and learning is going to be important, regardless of race, ethnicity, or social status. So I love the Envision Festival, where individuals come together as equals to experience their love of life, music, and dance. I just want to end with this final slide. There are a number of big data studies that are out there that Monica Rosenberg, who's now taken a faculty position at the University of Chicago, has reviewed in this Nature Communications paper. These are all studies that are highlighted that have at least 500 or more children where the brain brain development is being measured, as well as psychological development. And this includes the ABCD study that was alluded to earlier that's following. We actually recruited more than the original 10,000, so it's about 11,800, and Yale is one of the sites collecting this data. But what's going to be essential for all of these studies is that we consider the social environment in which this development is occurring. And that social environment is going to play a key role when we consider trying to predict the outcomes, risk, and resilience. So I just want to end by acknowledging the many institutions, institutes, organizations that have helped to support this work. Give a big shout out to the Fab Lab and 3 amazing colleagues, there are many at Yale. And I also have to acknowledge my son, who has given me an incredibly unique view into this late adolescent period. So thank you.
Thank you, BJ, for this fascinating lecture. Well, there's no reason for any of you to delay gratification any longer. I welcome you all to the opening reception and poster session, which is at the ICPS exhibit hall upstairs. So if you make your way outside, you'll be shown the directions.